everybody. Welcome to another episode of Webcomics Confidential. This is Brad Geiger talking to you from my palatial Huntsville, Alabama hotel room. My younger son is in space camp here in Huntsville, and I'm holed up in a travel lodge and trying to get some comics and some videos done. And this is my life for the next week. So you're going to see this background here, at least for the next couple of videos. Today's topic is one that was written in just this morning, as a matter of fact, and it was such a good one I wanted to kind of move it ahead to the queue. However, having said that, if you've got a question, if you've got something on your mind, if there's a topic you'd like me to talk about, by all means, hit that contact button at the top of the site and drop me a line. Let me know what you would like me to talk about. However, today, the topic's already settled, and what it is this. A writer writes, a webcomics.com member writes that she's bringing her comic to an end, and she wants to know what she should be doing to do that properly. How do you properly bring a comic to an end? It's a great topic. So here, let's talk about it. First and foremost, let's talk about the psychology of ending a comic. And I want to get this right up top because it's so important for so many of us. I saw a great quote somewhere the other day that it said, "Don't stick to a mistake just because you spent a long time making it." Oh, and by the way, I know this person's comic. It wasn't a mistake. So let's not confuse the issue here. But so many of us are hesitant to end one comic and move on to another project because we've been it's been pounded into us because so many of us look to either syndicated comics or mainstream print comics as an indication of what we should be doing. And in those comics, what we see in terms of the greatest successes, and meanwhile, remember, we're only looking at the tips of the iceberg. There's so much beneath the water that we're not seeing when it comes to this topic. But everything that we've seen has been done for decades, whether it's Spider-Man, Peanuts, Garfield, Batman. All these properties are things that have been pounded out month after month, day after day, year after year, and we think that if we are to be successful, we have to come up with that one great thing and churn it out year after year after year. And it keeps us, that mindset keeps you from realizing when it's time to move on. The fact of the matter is that there were so many false starts before Garfield. There were so many false starts before the Fantastic Four. Take a look at Marvel Comics history, for example. Before they started doing superhero comics, they were doing westerns and romance. That was back when they're called timely comics, right? Jack Kirby didn't become Jack Kirby until he was well into his 40s. Fantastic Four was put out when Kirby was well into his 40s, all right? There were so many other things that had gone on that we don't see, but we don't see that. We just see the Fantastic Four. So when we're doing our thing, we think that it's supposed to be this thing that we do forever. And the fact of the matter is, it's important to move on. It's important to realize when this comic has come to its end. And maybe it didn't go as far as you thought it would. Maybe it didn't get as popular as you had hoped it would. But your ability to grow as an artist is going to hinge upon your ability to know when it's time to bring something to an end. Do not be afraid of the end. Like I think I said this in an earlier webcast. Everything has a beginning, middle, and an end. Everything. Every relationship, everything that you do is going to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And your comic that you're working on right now, it's going to come to an end eventually. The question is when and under whose power and how. And also let's demystify the end a little bit. Every comic that's been brought to an end can be restarted. If you down the road, if you decide, oh man, I really shouldn't have ended that comic, you can restart it. There are no rules to this. However, there are some ways, and this question writer brings up a really good point. How can I do that to alleviate any potential negative outcome as much as possible. And that's what we're going to talk about. But I wanted to preamble there first in that it's really, really important that you are open to the idea of bringing your comic to an end. Don't stick with that. There are those of you that I know that I see you. I see you on webcomics.com. You've been doing a comic for 2, 3, 4, 5, and up, that many years, and it is not getting traction. It is not going where you thought it would go. It is not happening for you. Your best bet is to leave yourself open, I think, in my opinion. Leave yourself open to the idea of bringing this one to an end and starting a new one. Not with a sense of failure, but with a sense of, oh man, look at all the things I learned from doing that. I'm going to take that and apply it to this new project. Maybe something that you're more fascinated with. You've got more of a creative fire to do. Don't stick with that old comic just because you put a lot of time into it. You're always going to be able to get that out. And we're going to talk about the concept of webcomic equity. All right? You're always going to be able to draw out a certain amount of equity that you've put into a creative project. That's going to happen, especially if we do a few things that we're going to talk about coming up here. Are you going to lose a certain amount of readers that liked the old thing and don't like the new thing? Yeah. And guess what? You're going to gain a bunch of new readers who didn't like the old thing and do like the new thing. Readers come and go. We get so obsessed over readers, keeping readers, gaining readers. And believe me, when you're in the building stages of doing a comic, absolutely you're obsessing over gaining readers. Everything that I talk about when it comes to this topic is about reader retention, especially in the early stages, retaining those readers. However, once you've been at it for a few years and you see yourself plateauing, it's no longer about retaining readers. It's no longer about gaining new readers. It's about maybe you've taken this thing as far as it can go and it's time to start thinking about something new. So, with that in mind, let's talk about webcomics equity. When I was a kid, in my 20s, I couldn't, people told me all the time that I should be buying a house. I was renting an apartment, and I couldn't understand why they were saying I should buy a house. I loved living in an apartment. Living in an apartment is great. If the plumbing clogs up, you call the building superintendent. If something falls through the roof, no skin off your nose. As long as it didn't fall on your head, you don't have to patch the roof. I loved. The more I talk about it, maybe I'll go back to renting. But they were saying there's something called equity that builds up. And the concept of equity is that you buy a house and hopefully the house appreciates a little bit in value. And when you sell that house, you get some extra money there and you can apply that to the next house that you buy. And you keep applying that equity. In other words, instead of an apartment situation where you're paying rent and then you get nothing for your money other than you got to sleep inside out of the rain for another month. Under the concept of equity, that money is always being used to build something that you can then sell and hopefully make a little bit of money off of and go on to the next house where you build equity and so on and so forth. So you're ready to retire. Move to one of those nice little retirement communities. Maybe one in Huntsville, Alabama. Such a nice town. So that's the idea of equity. They could not get it through my head. Until finally it came time to buy our first house, and my wife used a nice-sized brick to help get it through my head. Since then, the concept of equity has been made crystal clear to me. There's been a couple situations where we've needed to, for example, refinance our mortgage. The sewer went out. We had to borrow against the house and stuff like that. That equity has come in handy a number of times for us. Webcomics are the same way. You can build equity in a webcomic. So, how can you position yourself to make the most of this? Well, number one, I feel very strongly about this. When you're promoting, and this goes from the top on down, but mainly on social media, but also when you're thinking about your URL, I am more and more, as we go more and more past this idea, I get more and more fascinated with the concept of branding the artist and not the comic. In other words, I want to see the artist front and center. On social media, I don't want to see the name of your comic. I want to see you, because that comic is finite. You are, well, you're finite too, sorry to tell you, but you're more infinite than your comic, on a sliding scale, okay? You're going to last longer than your comic. Okay, so don't, in my opinion, I would not build social media branding around the comic so much as I would build it around you as a creator. And if you're building that first URL, I'm a big fan, more and more, of making that URL your name. Alex Heberling does this beautifully. If you look at her comic, The Hughes, it's thehughes.alexheberling.com. And if she decides to do something else, that's going to be thatthing.alexheberling.com, and so on and so on and so on. I like that idea more and more, because what that's saying is, this is something that I'm going to work on for a finite period of time, and then there's going to be something else, but you're always going to build that equity to that central URL. I really, really like that idea. The further we go along, the more I'm convinced that that's a good thing to do. If you're in that position right now, if you're just starting out, I would think long and hard about branding even the site, not only your social media, which should be a given, but the site. Brand that on you, not necessarily the comic. I really like that. So that's one thing that you can do, but that doesn't do this question writer any good. She's been doing it for a while, right? She's too far down the road to change that up. So here's what I think you should do. Number one, after congratulating yourself for bringing a comic to a successful end, I like that phraseology. Well, there's so much failure trapped up in end. Let's talk about the successful end. You bring that comic to a successful end, however you want to do it. I'm not going to tell you in terms of writing how that should end, whether you should write a happy ending, a sad ending, a smarmy, sappy, melodramatic ending. I really don't care. That's up to you. Here's what should be happening on your site, however. Number one, you're going to want to convert that home page to a landing page layout. And in other words, the worst things that you can do is to kind of leave it the way it is right now with the last comic up on the page. If I'm assuming you're doing things the way 90% of webcomics are being done, and go back to some of the other videos to rethink whether you should be doing that. But the worst thing you can do is leave it like that. What you want to do is convert that to a landing page layout, so that when people come to that site, the first thing they see is a landing page, something that gives them an encapsulated idea of what they just arrived at. Somewhere near the top, there should be an indication that this is no longer a live comic. This is an archive site for this comic. This comic has come to an end. There are no new pieces of content being developed for it, and that should all be communicated relatively high and clearly. All right? The first two things that new person coming to the site needs to understand is, what is this comic all about? And this is an archive comic. That's the main thing. Now, at that point, the other things that you can do is, first of all, and this is secondary only to those first two things, but of next to greatest importance, promote the new products. Promote the new content. Promote, what are you doing that's new? What have you moved on to? And if there's two of you or a team of you, each team member should get an opportunity to promote their new thing in an equitable way, in a way that makes sense to the amount of time and effort that this person contributed to the team. The new products should absolutely come next in terms of importance. What's next for these people? If you do happen to like this, where can I go to find out more about these creators? Next thing up, in order of importance, is number one, I want a link to the very first page. I want a link to the very beginning, send people as far back as possible. And number two, I want links to the best loved storylines. In other words, that thing is still sitting there. If you've got ads on it, it's still generating ad revenue. And if you are still doing the ad thing, and maybe you've moved on like some of us have, but if you are still doing the ad thing, then that's part of your equity too. You should be using that site to generate page views and thereby ad views. Okay, so the next thing I want to see there is jump to the very beginning of the storyline, and also links with images. You know, you're an artist. You know that this is a visual craft. Links and images that send people to the best loved storylines. You still want to generate page views with this thing. It's part of your equity. And next down the line is and this might okay. Let me put an asterisk here. Whether this is next or before what I just said is completely contingent on whether you're still running ads. If you're still running ads, keep going the way I just said it. If you haven't run ads, above the links to the storylines is going to be links to things like your Patreon, any live Kickstarters that are going on, stuff like that. Your crowdfunding. That should be, if you've given up on ads, then the next thing that you can easily be doing is promoting your Patreon. That's worth a link, right? Because people are still going to be coming to this site, especially in the first year or so. People who don't know that you've ended are still going to be coming to the site. They might be binging on this content that they haven't caught up on yet. And that's still worth a shot, at least, in converting some Patreon dollars in there. And if you've got a Kickstarter that's going live, you should be absolutely going back to that old site and putting a link up there to the crowdfunding. So those two things, depending on where you fit in the spectrum, are going to kind of compete with each other. And also, right near the top, and of very great importance, is ebooks. What are the ebooks that are available? How can and any other merchandising, T-shirts, physical books, so on and so forth. Your store should absolutely be of high prominence on this page. You want people to shoot over to get ebooks, to get physical books, all of that stuff that you have. That's also part of your equity, getting as much money out of this thing as possible. All right? Those are the things that I'd like to see you do with your site. Now, here's the other really good position you're in. As you're bringing this comic to a close, all of the people who are following you are going to have a little bit of emotion invested in this. They're not going to want to see it stop, and that's okay. Don't let that sidetrack you. And I know that's weird to say. Readers hate change. No matter what, readers hate change. I've told you this story 100 times. I'm going to tell it to you again because it's my vidcast. There was one time I made a change in my comic that gave me the greatest amount of negative email that I had ever gotten. You know what it was? Of course you do, because I told you a million times. I switched from black and white to color. I've been doing this for 17 years, and that was the greatest amount of negative email I've ever gotten, was when I switched from black and white to color. By the way, it was the right idea. It was a great idea. And if you remember how the story goes, I started second-guessing myself. I had the person who was developing the site at the time for me, I had him create this code that people could still click over, plant a cookie on their browser, and it would only show them the black and white version of the comic. I spent the next several months posting a black and white and then a color version of each comic. And I was doing 6 days a week back then. Each comic that went up in black and white and color until a couple of months later, and it wasn't very many months later, when I checked to see if anybody was using the black and white cookie, nobody was. They just don't like change, all right? It was a huge mistake for me to go jump through all those hoops, waste all that time and energy on a very low ROI kind of prospect. It was a dumb thing to do. Don't let your readers talk you out of ending your comic if you've decided that you want to end your comic. If it's right for you, if you don't get to this point without putting a lot of thought into it. Don't let your readers sway you back, because it's exactly the same thing as that reader who tells you that they totally, absolutely, completely buy a T-shirt with that design on it. You know that reader who's telling you that they're going to buy that T-shirt is the first one to disappear when you put that T-shirt up. If you've been doing this for more than a day, you've already experienced that. All right? So don't let your readers sway you. If you've come to this decision, you've come to it. But they are going to be emotionally invested. That's good. You want that. Now, and don't tell them I said this, but we got to talk business here, right? Profit from it. At the same time you're ending your comic, you should be kickstarting some kind of book to celebrate the culmination of this work. Whether that is the last book in a series of books that collects your strips or your comic, your storylines, or whether it is a what do you call those things? Omnibus. Omnibus. You see how my brain works. An omnibus where you collect several of the previous books into one big hardcover volume. You should absolutely be profiting. Sorry, readers. I hope none of you ever see this. You should be profiting off of their emotion. Okay? They're going to be charged up about this ending. Things that are ending get people wound up. Look at any Kickstarter campaign that's ever been launched. They make their most money on the first 3 days and the last 2 days of the campaign, because people get really charged up. This is coming to an end, and I'm going to be left standing by the shore as the boat sails into the harbor. Nobody wants to be left standing on the shore. Okay? Use that. You should be doing a Kickstarter to do something to celebrate the end of this comic. Whether it's, like I said, the last book in a series, an omnibus, a hardcover collection, a box set. Use your imagination. But you should absolutely be doing something to celebrate the end of this comic. And by the way, as long as you're doing a Kickstarter, put a little thought in the back of your mind to make something related to the new project a stretch goal. Right? You want to deliver as much traffic from that old thing to the new thing. If you think and I think you got a pretty good shot in most cases of people that have been reading your comic for a while, getting kind of emotionally invested and participating in this Kickstarter. And remember, Kickstarter is great at delivery. So if I think in the last 2 or 3 of my Kickstarter campaigns, I figured 30% of the people that came aboard never heard of me before. They discovered me through Kickstarter, right? So you want, between that discovery and your reader's emotional investment, you want to point some of that to the new project. Consider you might have, since the new project probably doesn't have any stuff done for it, that might not be a book, but it might be something else. It might be something small. It might be a bookmark. It might be a poster. It might be a mug. God, use your imagination. But consider some kind of stretch goal that points the way to the new project. That's something that could do you a lot of good. In other words, you should be making the most of this time. Don't get all wrapped up in, this is a failure, I'm bringing it to an end. This is a celebration, the culmination of something that you've put a lot of time into. We should be celebrating it, okay? And that means you got to get your head straight. You've got to look at this for what it is, and consider the fact that you're in a really fantastic position right now to do a lot of things, one of which is merchandising, the other of which is drumming up a lot of publicity to point to the new thing. Then, as long as your comic site has been switched over to reflect an archive site that also does a number of merchandising type things, you're going to be very, very well positioned to convert all that web equity that you've put in into the next stage of your creative life. So, that's my thoughts on ending a comic. If you've got some comments, by all means, head over to webcomics.com. Hit me up. Let me know what you think. Maybe you've ended a comic. Maybe you'd like to share your experience. Well, do a guest column, do a guest post for webcomics.com. Let us know what your experiences were. I'd love to have more guest content here on the site. Every time that somebody's taken the opportunity to share something from their point of view, I end up learning all kinds of great stuff. And it's good for the entire membership of the site. So do consider that. Have you been through this? I have. I've ended Greystone Inn. I did a lot of things wrong in it. I could probably write an entire post just on all the stuff wrong I did. But yeah, do think of that. Do think about sharing your experience if you've been here. This is Brad Geiger. This has been another episode of Webcomics Confidential, and hopefully, again, from my palatial hotel room here in Huntsville, Alabama, I'll be seeing you next time.